So hello and welcome to If These Walls Can Talk, Stories from Southern Oregon's National Register listed properties, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Carrie Tannehill, Head of Adult Services. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphones and turn off your camera if you choose, so we can have a quality recording. The recording of today's program will be uploaded to the JCLS Beyond YouTube channel within 2 weeks. There will be time to answer your questions at the end of the program. If you want to put them in the chat box during the presentation, George will get to them at the end. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official position or policy of Jackson County Library Services. Today's presenter is George Kramer, and he has a master's in historic preservation from U of O and has been researching and writing about Oregon buildings for over 30 years. So thank you, George, for being with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and give it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this Windows in Time. It's always fun to present them, and hopefully we'll all have some fun and learn some things. This is titled If Walls Could Talk. It's stories from National Register listed properties in Jackson County. Most of them are properties that I have listed over the years. I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about what the National Register is and what the National Register is not. Officially, the National Register is the official list of the nation's worthy places, and it was created by Congress and the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. And it's administered by the National Park Service. And it's designed to protect not just buildings, but sites, structures, objects, and districts. And you've probably heard of National Register historic districts. Medford, Ashland all have districts. So does Grants Pass. And a lot of people think that being on the National Register, that everything that's significant in the country has already been evaluated and is listed on the National Register. And nothing could really be further from the truth. Getting on the National Register is something of a Herculean task. It was created, as the slide with Mark Hatfield alluded to, in 1966 because the government was undergoing a lot of major infrastructure work. They were building freeways, and they were doing urban renewal, and in the process were destroying a lot of historic buildings and historic parts of communities. And the National Conference of Mayors complained about that. They said, you know, you're putting these freeways in the middle of our towns, you're dividing our communities, you're destroying our heritage. And the federal government said, wow, well, you know, maybe we should have a list about things we should avoid when we're putting in freeways or urban renewal projects. And from that, the National Conference of Mayors wrote With Heritage So Rich, which was a fairly important publication and set the standard that established the National Register of Historic Places. And the ultimate reason we have a National Register is not to celebrate the best of architecture or heritage. It's to identify those resources so that when a federal undertaking occurs, they know what to avoid. And that is a whole elaborate process that goes on to this day, that when the federal government has a project, and that can be anything from issuing a license to building a freeway, they need to evaluate what's significant historically in the project area and try to avoid it if they can. And so properties don't need to be pretty to be on the National Register. History isn't always pretty. And they don't need to be well designed. And we'll talk about some fairly average buildings that end up on the register because of what they represent, not so much what they look like. And then the other thing to remember is that all Jackson County has about 150 National Register nominations, some of which include many more than one building. A nomination for a district the Ashland Railroad District includes over 500 buildings. And so there are about 2,500 structures or sites in Jackson County that are formally listed on the National Register. There's probably far more that have just never been documented and never been nominated. And so then the question, of course, is why not? Why isn't everything that's historically significant listed or identified in the National Register? And the simple question is that nobody's ever asked. It's very expensive, it can be, to list a property on the National Register. It's a lengthy process. You have to justify something. And a lot of people want to spend that money or take that time, or they think there'll be regulations and limitations on what they can do, which is sometimes true. But just because something isn't on the register doesn't mean it's not significant. So I thought about calling this this thing, If Some Walls Could Talk. But basically what this is a smattering of properties in Ashland and Medford and Jackson County that are in fact listed on the National Register. That almost always means the property owner decided that was something they wanted to do and pursued that process. And so as I talk, you'll understand that National Register properties tend to be places of exceptional interest, and they have great stories. And if you work in one area like Jackson County, as long as I have at least, they all kind of relate. They all kind of go together. So let's start. I'll tell you some stories. The Southern Pacific Railroad Depot in Ashland started out as a 3-story hotel built in 1887 when the railroad line came to Ashland, connected from north to south. It was a huge, massive building, over 300 feet long. It was famous for its chicken dinners. People would get off the train. Ashland was a division point, and so people would stop while the train either took on engines or shed engines coming over the Siskiyous, got water, got wood for fuel or coal. The depot was a center place in town. In 1918, that's this town waving goodbye to the troops as they went off to fight the war. By the 1930s, the Natron Cutoff had opened. The main line of the Southern Pacific had shifted to Klamath Falls. Traffic in Ashland had significantly reduced. More people were traveling by auto than by train, and there was really no need for the big hotel. And so the railroad, never ones to be terribly sentimental about buildings, tore it down. And they took the kitchen wing, the south wing, which is the 1-story building you can see, and they converted it and called it the New Depot, significantly more modest. Ashland had been reduced in railroads. And the building below, the picture on the lower right, is what the depot looked like 40 years ago when it was still a freight depot. There was no passenger travel through Ashland, of course. And in 1987 was the 100th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike. And Southern Pacific, which still ran the railroad, wanted to have a little celebration at the railroad yards. It was actually quite cool. I attended it. The president of Southern Pacific was there. Oregon's U.S. Senators Mark Hatfield and Bob Packwood were there. And they came in and they reenacted the driving of the Golden Spike. The Southern Pacific decided it needed to clean up the yards before that event. They tore down a brick building that was left from the old roundhouse, and they wanted to tear this building down too. And town thankfully talked them out of it. But the railroad didn't want it. And so a local individual purchased the building, picked it up, and relocated it to the other side of A Street, about 2 blocks. It's an unusual building on the National Register in that often when you move a building, it loses its eligibility. Not always, as this case proves, but usually. And so in 1990, this building was restored, relocated into a new site, restored, and is been office space since. One interesting aspect of these buildings, things that I always think are worth pointing out, if you look at the current photo, you'll see that the lower 5 feet or so is a darker color. In 1887, when the building was built, it was also a darker color like that. But when they mixed the paint and brushed it on, they would put loose sand into the paint and paint that lower wainscot with a sanded finish. And the reason for that was that they didn't want people leaning against their building. It would be uncomfortable to lean against an original railroad depot. Medford has a depot too. Medford, being a larger city, had a series of depots. This is the 1910 Southern Pacific Railway passenger depot. It was built specifically for passenger travel. There was a second depot further south that was just for freight. In Medford between 1900 and 1910, as you probably know, was one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, grew almost 400%. And Averell Harriman, the president of Southern Pacific, came to Medford during the orchard boom period and thought, wow, this is a great, huge city. And so he commissioned this depot for a city that would be 3 times the size of what Medford was at the time. So it was a very, very grand depot in Medford. Medford didn't grow that fast. The passenger depot became a freight-only depot in the mid-50s when all the freight travel ended through Southern Oregon. And the building fell, I think it's fair to say, into disrepair. Someone purchased it from Southern Pacific, renovated it for use as a restaurant. I always tell the story with this building that the tile roof, the terracotta tile roof on the depot is original. And Southern Pacific spared no expense when they built this building. They put the roof up, however, without putting down any underlayment. And so 100 years later, it was renovated, and I think it was in the early 90s. And so the building was 80, 90 years old. The underlayment had all evaporated and the roof needed to be redone. And so they took all the tiles off. They redid the covering of the structure of the roof, and then they put the tile back on, breaking about 5 or 10% of the tile in the process. And so we had to go all over the country to find used tile. It's called Ludowici tile, and found matching tile and put it back up. And the cost of that tile for the 10%, had we had to recover the entire building, would have been more than the building sold for. So my client, who was a contractor, said, if he would have been smart, he just would have sold the tile and made more money than he did by restoring the building. Unlike the sand paint on the Ashland depot, this building's lower wainscot is brick. And if you look really closely in that little inset, it's kind of hard to see. People waiting by the side of the train would write their names, mostly in pencil, on the brick. And so when that was restored, and if you go to Porter's today and you look closely, you can still see all of that old graffiti, which I think is kind of nice about people in Southern Oregon. This is the Medford Central Fire Hall. It was built in 1908, sorry. And it was the first building that the city of Medford owned. Prior to this, the city offices were basically wherever the mayor worked, who for a long time, he was a pharmacist. And so I suppose part of running for office was you had to have a place to meet. And that obviously wasn't the most democratic thing in the world. Medford started to grow, as I said, between 1900 and 1910. And so they decided to build their first building. And they built the northern half of this building, the western half actually, which is the part on the corner. And it was built not only as the city hall, the city offices were upstairs, which they had books bookcases all around the perimeter, and it was Medford's first public library as well. It was also where the firemen slept, so they could slide down a pole, and there were two big front doors where the horses lived, Tom and Jerry. It also held the jail and all of the other city offices. One of the things, and then in 1921, that building was designed by John McIntosh. In 1921, Frank Clark, who you've probably heard of, came back and designed an addition carefully matching McIntosh's design. If you look really closely, you can see a vertical seam in the brick where the two buildings are joined. It's an unusual construction detail. It's not a good construction detail, but when you do an addition, you don't really have any other choice. One of my absolute favorite aspects of this building is the sidewalk out front. And if you look at it, you can see that it's scored in between the patches into little blocks. And the reason for that was not decorative. It was so that the horses, as they were rushing out to go fight a fire, would get better traction and not slip. And I rather love the fact that obviously Medford hasn't had fire horses for quite a long time. There are great stories about Tom and Jerry. But here we have 114 years later, 115 years later, the blocks in the sidewalk on the front of that building are still there. So that they can get good traction. And the Medford Public Works Department, when we put this building on the register and sort of pointed out what those were, the Medford Public Works Department very generously said, well, we'll keep them. We'll make sure that we don't damage them any more than we have to as we do street repair. There's a similar type of block on another National Register property in Medford, the Geneva, Minnesota district. And Geneva Street is scored with that kind of brick for the same reason, not for fire horses, but just for traction. And the city of Medford actually has a grid, a stamped grid that they use when they repair Geneva Street to replicate the pattern. And I think that's, every time I walk by that sidewalk, I think of Tom and Jerry rushing to a fire. Maybe you will too. Shifting to Ashland. Lithia Park was largely the creation of the Women's Civic Improvement Club, who looked at the old area, industrial areas along Ashland Creek, and thought that it would be a beautiful place for a park. And that sort of grew into Lithia Park and a whole marketing scheme. In the late teens, the Medford Civic Improvement Club, they were Women's Civic Improvement Club, needed a clubhouse, and they started to raise money. They hired A.L. Lamb, who was the husband of one of the women, to design this little building on Winburn Way, which was then just called, I don't even know what it was called then. And anyway, they started to build it, and as nonprofits sometimes do, they ran out of money. And it sat there sort of forlorn and half finished for quite a while. At that time in Ashland's history, a man named Jesse Winburn moved to town. Jesse, who's the guy on the horse in the upper picture, was kind of a character. He had become a millionaire by coming up with the idea of putting advertising in the subway system in New York City. And so he made a little money for every ad that was put up in the subways, and was very well to do. And for some reason, he ended up deciding to move to Ashland in the 1920s. He moved out here with a guy named Bert Moses, who ends up being the publisher of the Ashland Daily Tidings. And Mr. Moses was a nationally syndicated columnist who had a little column of sort of folksy suggestions on life called Sap and Salt. And Jesse and Bert built a house up in the Ashland watershed called Sap and Salt in the Woods, which is the log cabin you can see behind him. And Jesse was wealthy, and he was opinionated, and had a tendency of irritating the city by letting his cattle roam in the watershed, which the city was convinced was going to pollute our drinking water, and Jesse wouldn't corral his cattle. And so the city was forever suing him, and he was countersuing them. He decided that the city needed a hospital, so he bought one and gave it to the city, which is why Ashland had a community hospital for so many years. He thought that Lithia Park would look great in the pond if it had swans. And he asked the city fathers if they wanted to have swans, and they said no. So he bought a mating pair and released them, and Ashland suddenly had swans. And for those of you that have lived in the Valley a long time, you may remember that there were actually swans on the City of Ashland logo for many years. I tried to find that logo and I couldn't. So anyway, Jesse driving up and down what's now Winburn Way on the way to Sap and Salt in the Woods saw the half-finished Winburn Way Community Center, or the Ashland Women's Civic Club. And so he gave them the money to finish the building. And they had a celebration for him when they finished the building, and the children in the town, Winburn had a particularly fond relationship with children. He would buy them ice cream, and they would let them go up and go swimming at Sap and Salt. And anyway, the children wrote a little poem to thank Jesse Winburn for finishing the building. And the poem was, "His name is Jesse Winburn. He lives at Sap and Salt. He is the man we love the best. With him, we find no fault." And when I was in school at the U of O School of Architecture, you had to write a National Register nomination as part of your study. And for whatever reason, I guess it was kind of like it was the Preservation Olympics, you couldn't get paid for it. So the Winburn Way Community Center was the building I chose to nominate. And it was the first building I ever put on the register. And it's had a rough couple of years, but hopefully it's going to be restored in the near future and reopened. Back to Medford. The largest landowner between Medford and Jacksonville for many years was a man named Jacob Ish. He ran cattle. And he was reputedly at one point the richest man in Oregon. He had a niece, Sophia Ish, and she married a man named Henry Baker in the 1890s. And Jacob gave Sophia and Henry as a wedding gift 50 acres of land and enough money to hire a local architect and design a house for them to live in. And they did, at the corner of McAndrews and Jackson, I think it is. On Christmas Day, 1895, Henry was a ne'er-do-well and wasn't very nice to Sophia and leaves the picture, leaving Sophia with 3 young boys, one of whom was Matthew Baker, born on Christmas Day, 1895. And Matthew lived in this house the rest of his life. When Matthew died, he never married. He gave the 50 acres and the house to his nephews and nieces, who sold most, and one of the conditions of Matthew's will was that the house be put on the National Register of Historic Places. And I was hired to do that. At that time, the house only had electricity on the upper floor. There was a single bulb in each room. It had no hot water. The shower was literally a wash basin and a garden hose. And that's how Matthew Baker lived his whole life. It is a great, great house. We put it on the register. The property was sold and subdivided, and condominiums or townhouses or something were built. 1 acre around the house was reserved, and the house was restored. And I believe it's now offices. But it must look a lot different than it did when Sophia lived there. It has great, all of that detail on the 2-story front porch, that very elaborate detail, rightly or wrongly, is called chinoiserie, which comes from the word for China. And it was considered somehow to be Chinese, although it's not at all. But it is still there, which is amazing, a testament to the quality of the construction and of the wood. Another house in Medford, the H. Chandler and Alice B. Egan house, way in West Medford, up in the hills. Chandler Egan was the son of a very prominent physician in Chicago. And like much of Chicago's wealthy, there was a connection with the Rogue Valley during the orchard boom. So much so that they called it the Chicago Colony. And there's reasons for that I won't go into. But anyway, Chandler Egan had gone to college at Harvard, where I don't know what he studied, but he played golf on the Harvard team. And he ended up being the US national amateur champion for 2 years in a row in 1904 and 1905. Only one other person has ever done that, been the national amateur champion 2 years in a row. And that person's name was Tiger Woods. Chandler's dad purchased acreage for him in Medford and sent him out here to grow pears. And Chandler got here and realized he was 300 miles from the nearest golf course, which was in Portland. So he took part of the acreage Dad bought him and he built a golf course on it. And that ended up becoming, in a way, the start of the Rogue Valley Country Club. Chandler also designed this house for himself and Alice and built it himself. I don't know that Chandler had any formal architectural training. He clearly had skill in that regard. That angled window that you can see on the lower floor was his studio. He liked designing golf courses. There wasn't a lot of competition. And so he set himself up as a golf course architect. And for the next 25 years, pretty much designed every golf course in Oregon and much of the Northwest, and was really well regarded for it. His most famous course, or design, for those of you that are golfers, is the 18th hole at Pebble Beach, which is generally considered the single greatest hole of golf in the world. If you miss, your ball goes into the Pacific Ocean. Chandler he started to play golf again and was quite successful. And he died in the mid-30s of pneumonia. And it was noted nationally that the great Chandler Egan had died. If you look him up on the internet, H. Chandler Egan, went by Chan. His daughter, who was very elderly, in her 90s, I believe, passed away recently. And up in her attic, they found Chandler's medals and his trophy from when he competed in the Olympics. And those are all on display at the Amateur Golf Hall of Fame. There's great photos of them, these big, big trophies. Here in Medford, Chandler Egan. I told you that buildings were often connected. We're going to do a little series of connections now. This is the Sparta Building at the corner of Main and Riverside. It was called the Sparta Building because its developer, John Root, who was an orchardist, came from Sparta, New York, and wanted to build a building as an investment. And he hired local architect Frank Clark to design it. And Elmer Childers, who was a very successful second-generation builder in Medford, built it. And it was completed in 1911. The first tenant was the Pop Gates Charles E. Gates Ford, which was the first Ford dealership either in Oregon or certainly in Southern Oregon. And he occupied the lower floor. The reason the columns are spaced as they are is so you could drive a car through them. Pop was a very successful businessman. That's him at the wheel in that lower picture. So here we have John Root building a building for Pop Gates. Pop's house, Pop ends up getting elected as mayor of Medford. He served on what's now the Oregon Transportation Commission, ran for governor. Pop decided that Medford needed a better water supply, and in 1913, when he was mayor, almost single-handedly pushed through the Big Butte Springs water project. And when we're all in drought in Ashland and you have water in Medford, you should thank Pop. He almost bankrupted the city, but it was a good investment. City survived, and so did Pop's house. It's a gorgeous house, also designed by Clark, prominently sited on a corner with a big Dutch gambrel roof, and remains a private residence. It's right across the street from Roosevelt School. So Pop moved the Ford dealership out of the Sparta Building, and eventually what becomes KMED, the radio station, moved in. And those big towers on top are for the antenna for KMED, which broadcast from the upper floor. They had their studios up there. Many of their shows were all live. And the Sparta Building got this whole second life as Medford's first radio station. By the 1940s, KMED radio moved out. But while it was there, Bob Rule, who was the publisher of the Medford Mail Tribune, that's his photo in the middle, he was one of the investors in KMED. We'll come back to Mr. Rule in a minute. Anyway, in the 1940s, when war was declared, the US entered World War II in December of 1941. In January, late December of 1941, early January of 42, the US government funded $27 million to build an Army cantonment in what was the Agate Desert, is now White City. And they hired a firm that was comprised of three of the largest contracting firms in the Northwest to take on the job. And they incorporated as CMC, Contractors Medford Cantonment, and they needed an office. And they took over the old radio station offices at the top of the Sparta Building, beginning in January of 1942, completed in September of 1942. They built over 1,400 buildings at Camp White. And when we think of Camp White today, we think of White City, and we think of the Southern Oregon rehabilitation clinics, the old VA DOM, which was the Camp White Station Hospital. And in this plan of the building core of Camp White, the station hospital is that little block on sheet 7. That's it. The rest of it all got torn down. At the station hospital, building 200 was the administration building. And it was listed on the National Register by the VA, essentially to commemorate its relationship with Camp White and the changes that Camp White brought to Southern Oregon. Back to Mr. Rule. When Bob Rule was the publisher, editor of the Mail Tribune, he got involved in a situation called the Good Government Congress in 1932 that, I don't know, this isn't going to work because my slides, sorry. I'll just delete it. Sorry, we had a little problem with, here, I'll reduce it. Anyway, John Root, remember John Root from Sparta, the Sparta Building? So John Root built the Sparta Building, but lived at the corner of Peach and Main Street and built this house, also designed by Frank Clark, and lived in it for a while. He eventually sold it to a man named Llewellyn Banks. Llewellyn Banks was another very well-to-do transplant to Southern Oregon. He came from Southern California, and he bought John Root's house to make it his home. During the Depression, Llewellyn Banks, along with some other folks, felt that the government was against them. and that the Depression wasn't fair, and that some people were making money and some people were paying for it. And banks bankrolled and became a leader in what was called the Good Government Congress. And he was a newspaper publisher and an orchardist. And he railed against the unfairness of freight rates and taxes and all the rest of it. And Bob Root, the publisher of the Mail Tribune, editorialized at great personal risk against the Good Government Congress, who were known to drag editors out of their offices and literally horsewhip them in the street. That happened in Jacksonville. In the 1932 election, an associate of Banks, Earl Fail, ran for county judge, county commissioner. They had another candidate that ran for sheriff under the Good Government Congress. And they attempted to take over local government. Fail got elected, so did Gordon Schimmerhorn as sheriff. There was some question to the propriety of the ballots, and somebody stole the ballots before they could be recounted and threw them away, most of them into the Rogue River. That didn't sit well with Bob Rule, who wrote editorial after editorial about what was going on in Southern Oregon government. It culminates with arrest warrants for Judge Fail and Llewellyn Banks. And George Prescott, who was an elderly constable for the Medford Police Department, walked up those steps to the front porch to serve a warrant for Llewellyn Banks on the crime of sedition, which is essentially organized overthrow of the government. Llewellyn Banks took a shotgun and stuck it through the door and shot Constable Prescott in the heart and killed him. He was immediately arrested and spent the rest of his life in prison. Bob Rule, so yeah, having all kinds of problems here. Bob Rule and the Mail Tribune won a Pulitzer Prize for its campaign against unscrupulous politicians in Jackson County, Oregon, which was quite the honor for a small town paper like the Medford Mail Tribune. And many of you probably remember that the masthead of the Mail Tribune used to say a Pulitzer Prize winning paper. And so here you have three properties, the Spartan Building, Pop Gates House, and the Banks House, all of which have a story that connects them. Back to Ashland, the Alice Applegate Peel house, Emil and Alice Applegate Peel. Alice Applegate was Lindsay Applegate's daughter. She is reputedly the first white child born in what is now Klamath County, because her father was the Indian agent for the Klamath Indian Reservation. Lindsay Applegate, of course, is one of those Applegates. He and his brothers cut the Applegate Trail into Oregon. Alice was a very independent woman. She went to college. She graduated. She was the first high school principal in the state of Oregon, female high school principal. And she married Emil, who had a blacksmith shop on the Ashland Plaza. And they built this house on Granite Street. If you know Ashland, there is the Alice Applegate Peel Walkway, which is a set of steel stairs that runs from Granite to the plaza right behind the Winburn Lake Community Center, so that Emil could take the shortcut and not have to walk the long way around to get to work. When Alice and Emil built this house, they hired two masons, Brown and Coombs, L.R. Coombs, to do the plasterwork. And Mr. Coombs was South African, from South Africa. His house is a wonderful house up on Scenic. And when they were remodeling this, they found that little black and white etching sketched into the brown coat of the stucco on the walls behind the original kitchen cabinets that had not been seen since 1910. And if you look really closely, you can see at the bottom, there is a line that, if I remember correctly, says something to the effect of "Me fala utores," which not speaking Latin, I somehow figured out was Latin in the 90s. And there was no Google then. And so I called the university, Southern Oregon State University, to see if anybody spoke Latin, if they had a Latin department. They don't. And so then thinking, where else would I find someone who knew what this meant in Latin? I went to the local Catholic church, and the priest was very helpful. And what Mr. Coombs, I'm convinced it was Coombs because he stayed in town for many years and was educated. What he had scrawled in their walls was in the back of their cabinetry was "Me falla utores," which means something along the lines of "use my walls," which I thought was kind of a nice sentiment. Also in Ashland, the Peerless Rooms, sometimes called the Peerless Hotel, today called the Peerless Hotel. So it was built in two phases. In 1904, you can see that vertical seam at the arrow. It was built as a little one-story building, as a barbershop, a mirror barbershop. They came in 1910 and cantilevered over the top of it and built a two-story hotel around it. This was what was called a salesman's hotel. They were little single rooms with shared bathrooms, and it was entirely designed for people coming on the train, salesmen coming on the train. They were called drummers. And they would have a place to stay that they could walk to the depot. If you've ever seen the movie The Music Man and that famous starting scene with all the salesmen on the train, you got to know the territory. This is where those guys would stay. Every room had a wood stove. No room had a bathroom. And that's pretty much the way it looked in the 1980s when it was put on the National Register. And it was upgraded and is now a hotel, has been a hotel for many years. The little sign on the corner, a wall graphic, has been there for many years. And these buildings, like I say, everything has a story. The owner of the building didn't pay Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola paid the building owner. Itinerant wall dogs would travel around the country, usually on train. They would find visible locations and go to the business owner and say, can I paint a sign on the side of your building? And the payment for that was that little black and white box up on the top of the sign where they would advertise your business. And that black and white box is called a privilege, because Coca-Cola would provide it to you for the privilege of using your building. Talent. Hanscom Hall, built in 1906, was a two-story building. The second floor burnt in 1912, but the bottom floor survived. Most everything else in Talent also burnt in 1912. It was the post office, and it was the city hall, or not the city hall, but the post office, before they could rebuild. By the mid-1990s, it was in pretty sad condition. That's that lower building. And then, of course, in 2008, it burnt entirely. And so it's gone and will not come back. The building next to it, the Monroe Garage, built in 1924 by Theodore Malmgren, who was a local physician from Phoenix, as an investment. It was originally a gas station. It was repaired and became a pottery sales area. It burned entirely in 2020 as well, but because it was concrete, the walls survived. And it will probably be the next building in Jackson County to be put on the register, because there are tax advantages to doing that. And the owner wants to rebuild this building just the way it was before the fire. And those tax advantages will help. I was quite tickled. Some of you might have seen the article in the paper that the National Park Service agreed that even without windows, doors, or any interior woodwork, this building retains sufficient integrity to relate its historic character and design. And we now have to restore it to that and keep it on the register, and I hope we will. And so I'll finish quickly so we have time for questions by reminding you that lots of buildings that are historic never get listed on the National Register. Almost all of them have great stories like the ones we've been talking about. History is really fragile. We lose historic buildings all the time, sometimes through fire, sometimes because people need more parking, sometimes because people just don't have the money to maintain them, sometimes because people have other ideas. And I hope the reason I do these talks is I want people to think about the history around us, think about how fragile it is. We don't need to save everything, but we ought to think about things before we lose them.